Prigozhin's failed revolution has weakened Putin's grip on power irreversibly. Putin relies on a kind of aura of inevitability and perceived legitimacy, which is in turn dependent on Russians not being able to ask the question, what if not Putin? Now it's a little more possible to put that question on the table for Russians and say, what if we don't go down to the bottom of the inferno with Mr. Putin? What if there is an alternative? So, to some degree, and this is really significant, Mr. Putin's legitimacy and inevitability have lapsed into real politics.
Обращаюсь к гражданам России.
Mr. Putin's speech condemning the mutiny came half a day after the mutiny started, and the speech was pathetic. It had an amateur historical reference to the 17th revolution, and then it was just morally imploring people to protect the state and to protect him. This wasn't a tyrant saying, I'm going to take control. This was a crybaby saying, save me, save me, save me, save me. And underneath all of that was incandescent anger at Prigozhin, because Prigozhin triggered Putin's most traumatic reaction and biggest fear, which is to end up in a kind of Gaddafi predicament. So the idea of revolution is Putin's worst nightmare, and that speech conveyed rage at Prigozhin and gave people the indication that Putin is going to deal with this situation toughly. But what happened? There wasn't a follow-through. There might be, but so far that speech didn't get translated into practice. And this gets worse. The Putin regime is itself a quasi-mafia-like organization, but in recent days, we've had pictures of a gang of bandits taking over a couple of major cities in Russia and heading toward Moscow. Then there was another gang of different bandits going out from Chechnya to potentially confront these bandits. And Mr. Putin is supposed to be a guarantor of stability. What stability are we talking about? And the nail in the coffin, to round off the humiliation, is that it's clearly that Mr. Putin is responsible for this column of Wagnerites driving around this country. It's the direct result of his delusional, brutal, imperialistic invasion of Ukraine. So when you are seeing this and you're a Russian citizen who wants to think, you can say to yourself, it's Putin that's done it.
Которые не дают нам боеприпасы.
Let's say a sentence or two about Prigozhin's history. He's in prison in the Soviet period for criminal offenses. In the 90s, he meets Putin. He gets wealthy with lucrative catering contracts. In 2014, when he's in the mercenary business, he's involved in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He's involved in various operations in the global south. He's involved when Putin invades Ukraine in a full-scale manner in 2022, but only a bit, getting more involved once Putin's invasion comes to be disastrous. And the culmination of all of this is one of the most extraordinary things in contemporary political history. And that's Mr. Putin saying to this ex-convict mercenary catering chap, you can now go and raid our penal colonies and withdraw from them 50,000 men to fight for you. That's an extraordinary destabilization of one's monopoly over organized violence that for Putin was a kind of a necessitated gamble, an act of faith. But coming back to today, why did Prigozhin's revolution fail? Clearly, something that needed to go well for Prigozhin didn't, and something that he needed to avoid going badly was about to imminently go badly for him. So what's the good stuff that he needed to happen that didn't happen? He needed more of the army to give the indication of sympathy and coming over to his side, defection. But he also needed elites to witness that, and those who may have been on the bubble to get convinced by that process that they can follow through. On the downside, what he didn't want to happen was face a situation where if he went further, he would be obliterated and he would face a kind of cinematic death. It's possible that that was the scenario he faced when he was forced into the decision to turn around the convoy. Now, how did we get to this situation that a bunch of Wagner convicts were marching on Moscow? To understand this, you've got to go back to the workings of the Putin regime across its entire history. Putin's power in the last decade has been a touch overestimated by most Western journalists, and Putin's regime was excessively verticalized in how we understood its workings. What in fact happened was that Putin was outsourcing his power to the court around him and then waiting to arbitrate the mess and the conflicts that this outsourcing generated, acting as an arbiter and as a referee. And that worked very effectively. To begin with, that very same mechanism was applied to the workings of the war. Mr. Prigozhin was functional to the Kremlin when he was having a go at Gerasimov, but above all at Shoigu. The task there was to deflect flak that was going to come Putin's way for the war going badly, from Putin toward Shoigu. And there were other purposes too. For instance, to absorb a kind of resentment at the incompetence and corruption of the regime, which is almost the message that Alexei Navalny specializes in. But the point was that Prigozhin was supposed to absorb that resentment and then exercise a modicum of control over that demographic so as to keep it within reach, so as to keep it on tap. So there were purposes he was fulfilling that the Kremlin needed him to fulfill. However, eventually this got out of control because this method of outsourcing power and refereeing that worked in peacetime did not work once it was intensified and extrapolated onto the context of a deranged imperialistic war. And that thing that used to work for Putin so well for years nearly led to a successful revolution. Now that crack in Putin's aura of legitimacy that we talked about is going to be compounded by two inexorable patterns that ain't gonna stop or go anywhere. The first is the war coming onto Russian soil more and more widely and more unpredictably. So that doesn't just mean Ukraine conducting operations on Russian soil. That's going to be a pattern that's not going to stop as long as the war lasts, and as long as this regime exists, this war will last. The second pattern is, again, compelling in the light of what we've seen in the last few days, that Z radical opposition to Putin will be the main opposition he faces. And especially in the light of what's just happened, he's going to be under more pressure than ever to give in to demands for extra totalitarian turns and extra militarization of society and economy. Now notice, Putin himself actually wants to go in this direction, but he believes it's right to go there later. Putin's strategy is to exhaust the West, wait for the democratic collapse in the West that he dogmatically thinks is inevitable, then escalate the war again later in the 2020s. In terms of domestic policy, this means militarizing society, trying to fascicize the depoliticized Russian population, but not now, later. But the opposition he's going to face on the Z radical side may well push him into these steps prematurely, push him to do them much earlier than he wants and much earlier than in fact they might be doable. And then this gets even worse, because one of Putin's masterstrokes is not just that it's not clear what the parameters of the war are, but it's not clear what the parameters of Russia are. Russia under Putin has come to feel rather borderless. People don't know where it ends and where it begins. That's a very typical feature of empires in dissolution. And that, of course, is not going to help with the trend of the continued loss of monopoly over organized violence. All of this put together means that we are probably looking at an acceleration toward the transit of power to a post-Putin world. All of this will affect the situation at the front, and we've got to analyze how things look from the point of view of the catastrophically low morale of the Russian soldiers. Imagine being a Russian soldier. You've come out of a bleak, desolate, small town. You don't want to be there, you want to get away. It's partly fatalism and desperation that sent you to the front anyway. And you're asking, who do I represent when I am here? My bosses seem to be fighting between themselves. Why am I here? What am I fighting for? Is this war at all existential for Russia? And it might be existential for that soldier because they think their neck's on the line, they've got to kill Ukrainians or get killed. But it's not clear how that war is existential for Russia from their point of view. There aren't answers to these questions. And that creates an uncertain risk of a significant Russian military collapse mediated by extraordinarily low morale. And it might be that Ukraine needs to regain all of its territory. And this takes us to a very important question. And that's that the West is committed to Ukraine sustaining its independence and Ukraine surviving. But the West is ambiguous about a full-scale victory for Ukraine. And to understand more why that's the situation we're in, and to explore what more the West can and should do to strengthen Ukraine's position and eliminate the escalatory threat that Mr. Putin poses to us, not just now, but over the years to come. To understand all of that, watch this video next.